am a 33-year-old woman from Los Angeles. 3 years ago, my boyfriend and I, as planned for 5 years, turned 30 and sold everything that we owned, including my car. And we took his Trailblazer and decided to just travel around the States and Canada. I suppose you could call us backpackers, as we tend to chase good weather, find a state park, and back county hike into the wilderness for days at a time. My brother likes to joke that we are anti-establishment hippies. We don't necessarily live off the grid, but being the two of us, we have one prepaid phone, which we use for emergencies or checking in with family and friends. And also one MacBook, which I use for work. I'm a freelance writer and content creator, and I am on retainer with a company. I mostly write boring papers or web content. The whole point of our living situation is to live debt-free and have as few bills as possible. I only use free Wi-Fi, so 1 to 2 times a week we have to go to a city with a Starbucks. This background info is only important so you know more about who we are and how simply we live. Neither of us are involved on social media, and we know very little of Reddit and Instagram, or even use any apps, because our phone isn't a smartphone. We don't even text. Last summer we decided to do some back county hiking in Arkansas. It's one of those states that you don't ever really hear about other hikers visiting, but we read that it had some beautiful natural landscape, and it does. The rules at this particular park were pretty relaxed. We didn't need a permit, and there were a few basic laws and guidelines, but there was no check-in needed. We had all the basics and had planned to do a 6-day hike, 3 in and 3 out. The whole time we were out there, we didn't see or hear another soul, but on day 1, we were prepping to move off trail and find a camping spot as it was getting near dusk. Half-mile off the trail is usually the standard for us. We took what looked like some kind of animal trail, and about half a mile out, we saw a green 2-person tent. It was almost camouflaged in the foliage, so we stepped on it almost by accident. Some backpackers prefer privacy, and others are more social. I guess we're the more social type. We've had some great experiences camping near other backpackers, like sharing stories, food, and a joint or two. We were around 30 yards away from the tent. It was zipped closed, so my boyfriend shouted a greeting to make our presence known. No movement and no sound. We assumed this green tent guy either wasn't around or didn't want to be bothered, so we started off in a new direction to get some distance between us. We camped, never even heard a peep from them. We moved along the next morning and completely forgetting about the green tent, until nearing the end of day 5 on our trek back. We were again looking for a spot to camp off the trail when we came up on the green tent again, which I guess isn't that unusual, but normally backcountry hikers keep moving, so we really weren't expecting it. The tent flap was open, so my boyfriend yells his greeting again, and nothing. At this point he was saying that he wants to go check it out, and he thought it was weird and that maybe someone was hurt. I didn't like that idea from the get-go, because even though we hadn't had any bad experiences personally, we'd heard enough stories from other people about hermits and mountain men that want privacy and carry guns, etc. But my boyfriend assured me that we'd be fine, and if all else fails, we'll offer him some weed to keep the peace and we'd be on our way. But as soon as we get to within 20 yards of the place, the smell of decomposition is intense. My boyfriend has been hailing his greeting over the last 20 yards, and once the smell hits him, he stops and turns to me and says, "What if we find a dead body in here?" My skin crawled. I was immediately afraid. I've never seen a dead body before, and I didn't want to. The closer we got to the tent, the worse the smell got. I knew for sure we were going to walk in and see some old camper's rotting corpse. What we found was worse than that. Outside the tent was a dead doe's legs, all 4 of them covered in flies. It looked like the legs had been cut off most of the way, then ripped off the rest of the way. It was just a mess. And inside was the body and head of the deer, but the middle portion was swaddled in a blue fleece blanket that was blood-soaked at the bottom where the legs used to be. It was laying on its side, bottom facing the tent entry. The tail had been cut off, and the anus and vagina was covered in dried blood and gaped, like something had been penetrating it. The same with its mouth. The bottom portion was bent down at a scary broken-looking angle. The tent was open so we could see everything without having to go inside. Not that we would have anyway, because at this point, the smell was almost debilitating. There was a dirty, almost empty clear bottle of Jergens baby oil, and a stained green and white French kitchen towel, and that was about it. I immediately started crying and I begged him to leave. All he could muster was, "What the heck?" And we turned and ran. We ran to the trail and jogged down it for as far as we could go, until dusk was fully on us and we had to set up camp. We didn't go very far off the trail and neither of us slept. We didn't start a fire or use headlamps after full dark. We just sat up whispering to each other, going over and over what we had just seen. Every little noise startled us. It was like our brains were on red alert. I kept thinking that any moment, a deer rapist would come back to his tent, see our footprints or something, and know we were there and track us back to our tent. I've truly never been so scared in my entire life. Just before dawn, we tore down and started out. My boyfriend stopped at the ranger station on our way out of the park to report what we had seen. The ranger was a young guy around our age, and he looked as freaked out by our story as we were telling it. He wrote most of it down, and my boyfriend showed him on a map approximately where it had been. He asked if we knew how the deer was killed, and at that point we hadn't even really thought about it. We just assumed it had been shot. But because of the blanket, we didn't see a wound, and we weren't exactly giving it an autopsy either. We have since shortened our backcountry hikes to a maximum of 4 days. We've also been a lot less eager to call out to other campsites, and never approached another unmanned tent again. September 2010, my boyfriend Dave, his best friend Tony, and my best friend Liz and I were all coming back to our hometown for our final year of college after spending the summer in London. We'd had a fantastic time, staying in my uncle's apartment, partying and exploring such a big city. It was great. We stopped in a B&B this night about half of the way home, and we all woke up early, about 4, maybe 5, ready to set off again when we discovered that someone had obviously driven too close to our car and broke the right wing mirror off. Seeing as this was my dad's birthday present to me and I'd only had it barely 2 months, I was absolutely fuming. We asked the landlord where we could possibly find spares or something to use for the time being, but she said she'd driven past a makeshift scrapyard or something a while back. She said she wasn't sure if it was still there, but she even drew us a rough map and we got back on the road. I wasn't very sure she was right about her directions at first, because the closer we got to the area that she'd circled it in, the more desolate the surroundings were. Roads got more difficult and had gone from stone to dirt. Around us, there weren't any farms anymore, just long weedy grass and patches of forest. It had basically become a moor. We were about to head off because of the wild animals, and I just had to get over being a paranoid driver and deal without my wing mirror, when surely enough, my boyfriend pointed out in front to a handwritten sign directing us 2 miles down the road to cafe and car spares. We drove down into a little cove, surrounded by forest, and we all got out, except for my friend Liz, who was asleep in the back seat. There was a tiny hut with cafe spray painted on the roof, a caravan and a hill of metal, and bits of cars. As to be expected, we were the only visitors parked up in the front. The sun was up, but no lights or people were around. I guess they were still sleeping. I mean, it was about 6 o'clock in the morning. We all walked up to the scrap pile, and I had to fumble through, looking for a wing mirror or any sort of mirror that could do for the time being, until I could get it repaired. Tony picked up what could only be at least a decade-old mirror and suggested that we just take it and go. But me, being stupidly sincere, I insisted I had to give them money for it. I can't just take it and go. I knocked on the door and waited. Then a big, hard-faced man answered the door, and at first looked pissed off and tired, then smiled with a two-toothed smile. He leered at me for a few seconds, then seeing the boys approach, asked what we wanted. Tony handed him the mirror and asked how much for it. He said nothing, just to get to know us, to which I thought fair enough, I guess. 2 more of the men left the patio door on the other side. They turned and smiled. Both skinheads with teeth like meth addicts, and came over. They stank badly. He gave them the mirror and told them to go attach it to our car. He introduced himself as Ian, sat us down on the patio chairs, and offered us some sandwiches. I politely declined, but he insisted we must be hungry and to come in, and that women are the best at making sandwiches. I also declined again, finding him a little bit sexist at this point, and when he asked again, Dave more sternly reinforced that I said I don't want to come in. Ian muttered something, and then came and sat on the chairs with us. It became awkward quite quickly as he started asking questions. It started off innocently, like asking how old we were, where we were from, etc., and then became a little uncomfortable. He asked if I had a boyfriend, to which Dave answered, and then started asking us both what we liked to do to each other. how often we have intercourse and weird private stuff like that, to which we didn't answer at all. We just sat in silence until we heard Liz scream. We turned around and I saw one of the men meant to be fixing on the mirror with his hand in the back window grasping Liz's leg. The other man was looking around nervously behind the car, and we got up immediately and sprinted off the patio. Tony started running after the guys, but they both headed into the forest. Liz was hysterical. She'd found herself on her own in the car and a random man's hand running up her leg. I truly can't even imagine how terrifying that must have felt. I got into the back seat with her and consoled her while Dave came around the other side to get in and told us some nails were on the floor. We looked over and there were about 12 of them arranged around the tire, like the guy was ready to pop them. I couldn't really think why at the time, but now I wonder where they got all those car parts. We decided it was enough though. We didn't want to spend any more time there, mirror or no mirror, and we were ready to go when Tony was the last to get in the car. He closed the back seat door as we looked back and saw Ian re-emerge from the house with something long in his hands, running towards us. And then I realized he was holding a rifle, a hunting rifle. At this point, I actually bursted into tears and I hit the engine, slamming on the accelerator as hard as possible. The car started to go and we got up to about 90, forgetting the dirt roads and just driving over whatever until that scrapyard was completely out of sight. We didn't stop and we didn't look behind us until we were safely on the motorway, getting home. To this day, whenever I go to London, I take a train instead. This frightening situation happened during Thanksgiving break. My friend Angela and I were high school acquaintances, but got really close during college. Since we were from the same city and started interacting more because of the fact, naturally, we carpooled to and from our university to our hometown, which is about 5 hours away by car. At the end of Thanksgiving break, we leave around 11 p.m. and start our trip back. Around 3 hours in on the road trip, Angela, driving, tells me that she's starting to feel a bit sleepy. So rather than stop in the middle of nowhere and change seats, I decided to talk to her and keep her busy. We get into a really deep conversation and, for fun, we decide to Snapchat a little bit on the road trip, with the flashlight on. After laughing and Snapchatting, we see police sirens go on right behind us. Great, it's 2 a.m. and cops pulled us over. They stayed in their car for a few minutes, which seemed odd, but oh well, we thought. As I see two of them walking towards us, they whispered something to each other, but I didn't think anything of it at that point. One of them goes to Angela's window and the other to mine. "Hey there, ladies." The one by Angela's window says, "How are y'all doing tonight?" with this creepy-ass smile. Non-suspecting Angela responds, and she says, "Good." She then asks what was the reason for pulling us over. "Going over the speed limit," he says. Mind you, we were Snapchatting right before he pulled us over, and Angela was purposely going a little bit under the speed limit to not crash and to just be safe while we were on Snapchat. Confused, she just says okay and asks if he needs any documentation, to which he responds no. While all this is going on, the second cop by my window signals me to lower the window and I oblige. He then starts making insinuating comments and gestures toward me, pointing his flashlight towards my crotch while smiling, telling me how long my legs were as an excuse to look at them because I'm wearing shorts, and asking, "Oh, so it's just you two? I see." And what we were doing at this time in the middle of nowhere, amongst other things that honestly were not related at all to pulling us over and out of line for police officers to be asking. Then the first cop asks, "So, are y'all in college?" To which we respond, "Yes, actually we're heading to our university." I knew we screwed up there because they know we weren't heading anywhere close. He then proceeds to say, "College girls, huh?" to the other cop again with that eerie smile. Honestly, I thought, what the heck? These people are weird. By this time, we were beyond creeped out and we wanted to get out of this situation ASAP, but these creeps wouldn't let us go. They kept trying to make conversation while implying really weird sexual stuff like, "Y'all know where we're at? There's a prison nearby here, you know. I sure hope nothing happens to you ladies. Do you think anyone would know if something happened to you here? You know, all alone on the road." All while smiling creepily. I'm just in shock and I can't believe this is happening to us. These are the men we were supposed to trust and rely on, but here we were, trying to free ourselves of them, for our own safety. Wanting to finish this now, I asked, "Are we getting a ticket?" To which the cop by the driver's window says no, but I'll give you a verbal warning. All as I feel the other cop staring right at me. He wrote something in his notepad and said, "Y'all just be careful now. Wouldn't want anything bad to happen to you pretty ladies. Ain't that right?" Then the officer next to me tries to open the door. What the hell? Out of nowhere, he tried to open the door, but thankfully the doors were locked and my window wasn't low enough for him to reach in and manually unlock the door. After this, I was in total shock, just staring at him while he stared back. No explanation or anything. Angela quickly starts up the car, says thank you, have a good night, and speeds off. We didn't call our parents right then and there because it was the dead of night and we didn't want to worry them. But instead, Angela's boyfriend, who was already waiting for us at the university, and asked to be called and updated in case of anything. After driving in silence while constantly checking if they were behind us for about 30 minutes, I start talking to Angela. We are both shaken and speechless. I ask her, why do you think they stopped us in the first place if we didn't commit any infraction? Then we realized. They must have saw that we were two girls because of the stupid flashlights used while recording and pulled us over. They also probably stayed in the car before walking towards us to check if it was actually only us two or something of the sort. They gave an uncomfortable aura, and I wouldn't be surprised if they were planning on raping us or worse. When I was 19, I worked for a company that allocated labor to rural areas of Australia. Basically, all you had to do was tell them when you were available and they'd send you to a remote farm for a few weeks where you do whatever they needed done. It was hard work and long hours, but very good pay and good fun if you got in with a nice group of workers. When this occurred, I was working on a large property. I was told it covered roughly the same landmass as the state of Maryland, USA. About 9 hours from Sydney City, and the property itself was about 40 minutes from the nearest town. In short, it really was the middle of nowhere. I was working at the farm, clearing bushland with 3 other guys my age from the city. Our boss was a guy called Jeremy who owned the farm and supervised us while helping out with the work. Overall, he was pretty laid back and was generally really good to us. This summer in particular was very hot and the work was hard. So one day when the temperature hit about 38 degrees Celsius, about 100 Fahrenheit, Jeremy decided to give us the afternoon off. He said he knew of a water hole on the farm about a 25-minute drive north. And I was keen for a swim, but the other guys just wanted to relax for the afternoon. So him and I hopped in one of the work trucks and started heading across the property. It was mostly wide, empty expanses with a few clumps of scattered bushland. Jeremy wasn't much of a talker, so we drove more or less in silence. After about 20 minutes, however, he suddenly perked up and jabbed me in the ribs. You see that over there, beneath the 2 dead trees? I should mention here that if you're not familiar with inland areas, particularly those in Australia, they are brown or red and mostly flat and bland, meaning any bright colors stick out like a sore thumb. So you can imagine our surprise when we could see a large blue angular structure far off in the distance. We steered in its direction, and as we got closer, we realized it was a huge blue shipping container just sitting in the middle of nowhere. Jeremy was perplexed, and I asked him if he knew what it was, but he obviously didn't. He said he hadn't seen it when he drove through the same area about 5 weeks before, and he wanted to go and see what it was. Initially, we pulled to a stop about 100 meters away from it. At this stage, I had a really bad feeling. The whole thing wasn't right. It's just hard to explain. But if you can imagine seeing such a foreign object in the middle of a huge barren expanse, it had to be something weird. Jeremy, however, wanted to investigate, which I understood, given it was his property, but in truth, I was really anxious. As we got closer, things got even more bizarre. There was a big diesel generator behind it thumping away, and a CCTV camera on each side, all motion activated, so they buzzed from side to side, following us as we moved around. I tried to reason with Jeremy, something along the lines of, with all this security, someone obviously doesn't want us here. Let's just go. He brushed me off, however, reminding me it was his farm, and whoever had put this there was trespassing, so he wanted to go inside. Despite all the surveillance, there was only a small padlock on the huge door. We had some bolt cutters in his toolbox, and after a bit of struggle, we broke the lock and went inside. The first thing I noticed was the rush of cold air as we got in. The place was air-conditioned, which I must admit was quite pleasant on such a hot day. We searched around for a light switch, but I could already see that this was some sort of IT setup. There were flashing LEDs all around the place, and the sort of hum you hear when a hard drive is working hard. When we finally switched on the lights, we could see a sophisticated, albeit somewhat cluttered office setup. There were hard drives the size of bar fridges, and other computer equipment lining the walls, sometimes piled 2 or 3 high, in plastic storage boxes scattered around the far wall, and several desks with computer monitors arranged in the middle, complete with rolling office chairs. At this stage, I felt like I was in one of those nonsensical dreams. This made absolutely no sense. We wandered into the middle and sat down at the desk to see if the computers could give us any idea of what the hell was going on here. My heart was racing and I just wanted to bolt. We had seen by the CCTV, so if anyone was monitoring it, they already knew we were here. Jeremy, however, was adamant that we had to get to the bottom of this, so I put on a brave face and started looking through the computer. This went on for a while, but in short, neither of us had a very high grasp of technology outside of Facebook and Microsoft Word. The best I can describe it from my lay position is that it was endless lists of computer talk. It was like the old Napster or LimeWire download screens looked like, just constantly picking up and receiving data, then recording it on several windows. I gave up on the computers and walked cautiously over the far end of the container to the big pile of storage boxes. By then, I was pretty sure no one else was there, as there was nowhere to hide really, but I was still incredibly on edge. I decided against my better judgment to see what was inside all of these boxes. My brief sift through this box still makes me feel sick to my stomach. It didn't take long for me to realize that this box was full of posters, DVDs, and photos. I don't even want to tell you what I seen in there. Just know it had to do with explicit images and videos of children. These people were organized. I immediately recoiled, jumped up, and ran over to Jeremy. I could hardly string a sentence together. I said something to the effect of, "Mate, get out, get out, get up." I dragged him out, composed myself, and managed to explain what I saw. We jumped back in the truck and sped back to the house. The farm had no mobile phone reception, and we hadn't brought a satellite phone, so we had to get back to the landline to call the police. Once we called them, they still had to make it all the way to the farm from the nearest police station, which was in a town about a half hour from the town closest to the farm. As I mentioned, very remote. We waited, talking frantically about what we'd seen, until the cops arrived almost an hour later. They arrived with 2 4-wheel drives, and we jumped in and led them back. But this is where it gets worse. By the time we got back, the container door was open and there was a fire inside. We had only 2 small extinguishers in the cars, and these did very little. The fire department took over an hour to get there, by which stage most of the damage was already done. An arson report by the federal police almost found no evidence of the computer equipment described, and only traces of paper and cardboard. This means that whoever ran it knew we were there and had some time to come and remove most of it and get away. There were various ways to get off the property, and the landmass was huge. Since the police hadn't taken us all too seriously in the first instance, probably due to our poor explanation on the phone, aerial surveillance was almost impossible by the time we had pieced it all together. I took a keen interest in following it up, but with no real evidence of who might be responsible, the investigation went cold. I've kept in contact with Jeremy about it, and the shipping container is still sitting there on the farm, as it's just too expensive to move. I'll never forget what I saw in those boxes. To give you some context, this occurred roughly 14 years ago when I was 12 years old and living in Eastside Australian rainforest. When I say rainforest, our house was on a 40-acre property surrounded by bush. The house itself was owned by a Swiss man named Hans. Occasionally, he would come down with his tractor and slash the long grass surrounding our house so we could access slightly more of the property in the summer. It was also extremely handy because if you know anything about Australia, it's that we have tons of types of animals that can very easily kill you. We lived about a 40-minute drive from the small town center. This meant if we needed groceries, medical attention, or to contact our parents, say while we were at school, it would be a 40-minute drive before anything could be done. The house sat on the side of a large mountain, roughly 3/4 of the way up, so naturally most of the land we called home was strewn with valleys, nooks, and hideaways. We had trails we could walk, and they led to a stream and a small waterfall, maybe a 5 to 6 meter drop. It was truly a beautiful place, but considerably scary to me and my small siblings. 1 brother and 1 sister, slightly younger than me. We knew our neighbors on both sides of the property, but because the location of our house was pretty remote, our nearest neighbors were roughly a 10-minute drive away. One was a lovely old lady who used to wave to us when we got off the school bus before we made the trek to our houses every day. I think our parents had asked for her to keep an eye on us when she could. The other was the middle-aged man and his family. He was a real jerk who excavated around the bottom border where our properties met and continuously interrupted the stream and waterfall's clear flowing water supply. Lots of strange and creepy shit happens when you're living in the middle of nowhere, but one in particular involved a guy I certainly don't want to meet ever again. Being completely removed from people, it was extremely rare that we ever got visitors we didn't know were coming. And people we didn't recognize turned up. It was usually because they were lost and needed directions. One day, though, a man came roaring down our driveway. I remember running inside to tell my dad that someone weird was here. He immediately walked outside to see who this unwanted guest was. A little background about my dad. He is literally the most hardcore person you will ever meet. He has one leg after having it amputated earlier in his life, after having an accident on a motorcycle, while he was running from police. He was in the Navy and was brought up in a very strict household. He had grown up in a very rough part of Sydney's west, so he had some pretty shady contacts too. In short, he is really someone you wouldn't want to mess with. I wouldn't be surprised if he had killed someone in his prior life to having kids. Anyway, my dad goes outside to see what all the commotion is about, while my mom keeps us inside, being protective. The man has a large red furred dog in the back of his car that looks like a German shepherd. It snarled at my dad, but immediately cowered when the stranger told it to shut up. Our own dog Millie, renowned beast killer, just for the record, was snarling and going ballistic, while being chained up to the house. "Hi, my name is John." The way the man spoke was like he was a salesman, a really slick and smooth guy who on the outside seemed friendly, but with the overtone of wanting something. My dad immediately responded with, "So what the fuck are you doing here then, John?" The man was taken aback, obviously not used to dealing with someone as hostile as my dad. They then talked for a while, and I could hear my dad talking with a sense of confusion about whatever this man had to say. I did, however, overhear my dad say, "What the hell are you thinking? Just call the cops." Found out later that the lovely old lady next to us had died. Apparently John was on the other side of the property and went to visit and found her dead. He also asked my dad if they should move the body to make it easier for police to investigate. This is obviously why my dad was telling the man to call the police immediately. Anyway, later that night the police showed up to take a statement from my dad and John, who was hanging around at our house until the police arrived. I remember my dad pulling an officer aside and explaining that John wanted to move the body when he first arrived. The police left without any more questions, as it looked like she had died from natural causes. John was still at our house. I found him to be a very unsettling person. The way he smiled, like the dark color of his eyes. He was unfamiliar, but acting like he was one of us. I remember it was a school night and I was trying to watch TV, and he was playing songs on his guitar with my mom and dad at the table. I was angry because he was ruining my shows, and I told Mom I wanted him to go, that I thought he was weird. She smiled and told me that she felt the same, but told me I needed to go to bed. The next day, things seemed normal. Went to school, came home. Not seeing the familiar friendly face of the old woman stung a bit on my way past her house. It felt strange, and I hoped that she knew her family loved her before she passed. I was a bit sad on the walk home until halfway down the driveway, I noticed John's car again, parked out front of our house. I walked closer and was greeted by his dog, Rusty. He walked outside with my dad, and I heard him call to Rusty to his car as he was leaving. Apparently he was borrowing tools from my dad. Anyways, he left and waved goodbye, like he was someone that I was going to miss. Again, that sense of over-familiarity made me uncomfortable. I didn't know this man, I didn't like this man, and I was hoping he would never come down our driveway again. My dad then pulled me aside and asked me what I thought of John. Well, I labeled him a weirdo, and I told my dad I was hoping he wouldn't come back. For the second night in a row, when John returned my dad's tools, he was sitting in our house playing guitar and annoying everyone. My mom and dad were visibly unimpressed by the situation. I heard my mom and dad argue about him hanging around until eventually my dad told him that he needed to leave, as it was time for us to go to bed. He insisted that it was early and tried to make an excuse to stay. I found that very odd. I was polite enough to know when someone didn't want me around, so why didn't this man? Or if he did know, why wouldn't he leave? After ushering him out, my mom and dad had a big talk in their room, and my dad told us all that he didn't like John, that he was going to ask him to not come over anymore, and if we saw him again, immediately tell him. The next day was a Saturday, so we were going to blow up our cheap inflatable pool and go for a swim, as it was getting pretty warm. Around 11 a.m., the sound of a car thundering down the driveway alerts me and I go outside. I run back inside to tell my dad that John is back. Just like the first time I ever laid my eyes on John, my dad goes outside and we stay inside with my mom, watching and listening through a screen door. John again, with his weird overfamiliar smile and dark eyes, greets my dad and is met with, "Look, mate, I don't know who you think you are, but I don't want you coming back around here anymore. You scare my kids and my wife, and I don't want you to come back. Do you understand?" Didn't hear John's reply from his tone. It sounded like he was confused and tried to reason with my dad, but he wasn't having it and told him to go or he would call the cops. As he was leaving, my father said, "Don't come back or you'll be sorry." This is where things really get weird. As my dad lays this subtle threat on the man, his face completely changes to one of rage. He glares at us in the house, sticks up his finger and speeds out on the driveway, shouting profanities and churning up gravel, spraying it towards our house. My dad came back and told us we wouldn't be seeing John anymore, and if we did, we were going to call the police. I was relieved. This odd man made me feel uncomfortable in my own home, and the way he reacted when he left confirmed the feeling I got from him when I first saw him. I can't remember if it was the Sunday or the Monday after that day, but John did come back. He tried to reason with my dad and said sorry for whatever caused us to not like him. Before he even got out of the car, he said, "If you don't turn around and leave, I'm going to smash your face in." And he did just that. My dad then called the police to inform them of what happened. Apparently, they were going to go and talk to John. I didn't hear any more of what happened to that conversation. A few more weeks went by with no sightings or happenings with John, and we all felt like things were back to normal. This was until our mailbox had been tipped out of the ground and smashed, or possibly run over. I remember asking my dad what happened, but he wasn't about to give me any ideas. He later told me that he knew it was John after the way their last conversation ended. The next weekend after the mailbox incident, we went into the town to get groceries and a fast food dinner, as a bit of a treat, and when we came home down the driveway, my dad immediately stopped my mom from proceeding and said that something was wrong. Next to the carport, where we parked our car, at the back of the house, there was a window that opened to the bathroom. My dad must have spotted the window was missing. As we drove down, he got increasingly more tense until we all noticed the window was missing. I remember being confused in the back seat, not really knowing what was going on, until I saw it. A man, dark eyes, overfamiliar, coming from the window that led to the shower. My dad was exploding with rage. He told my mom to rush down the driveway so we could fuck this guy up. The man proceeded to escape the window and run down the back of our property into the thick woods. My dad, only being on one leg, let Millie loose as she was going ballistic, tied up to the house. She raced down the engulfed hill into the darkness, and she came back with nothing. My dad went out with his flashlight and couldn't find anything either. I'm not sure if anyone slept well that night. None of our possessions had been stolen or even moved, though. We must have caught this man just as he was entering our house. The police came the next day and searched for fingerprints, with no avail. My father was furious and again alerted them to John and his strange behavior. They told us they would look into it once again. That was the last time we heard from John that year. I had almost completely forgotten about him and had the summer off to enjoy myself and get ready for high school. The school I went to was pretty large considering where we were, but everyone seemed to know each other pretty well, including the teaching staff. Within my first week at the school, we were introduced to all the teachers and teacher aides. I was caught completely unaware when that overfamiliar dark-eyed man from the previous year was reintroduced as a teacher aide. Except instead of John, he introduced as Gregory something. I went into a little bit of a spin as I was trying to make sense of it all. I was 100% sure that this man named Greg something was the same man who had introduced himself to my family as John. At that moment, so many things rushed in my head. What if he killed that old lady? What if he didn't even live close by? What if he wanted to move the body so he could frame my dad? If he lied about something as critical as his name, what else was he lying about? What if police never even made contact with him? I was sitting there for a good 10 minutes trying to piece it together until the teacher called my name to bring me back to reality. That's when he noticed me. The look on his face when he saw mine was one that I'll never forget. He immediately recognized me. He looked shocked. His eyes were wide and he said nothing, just staring. I just found out his dirty little secret. I could sense that he was now the one feeling uncomfortable and on edge. Later that day, I rushed home to tell my dad who I had found. He was shocked and repeatedly asked if I was sure. He went to the school the next day and discovered that the man had put in for indefinite leave yesterday and may not return. When we learned of the news, my dad told me to watch out and to let him know should John or Greg ever return.